Most people think a housing crisis begins when prices look ridiculous. That is not where it begins. It begins when the price tag stops mattering and the monthly payment becomes the weapon. That is where millions of Americans are standing right now. They are staring at a house listed for $250,000, $500,000, $1 million, even $2 million. And they think they are looking at 4 different homes. They are not. They are looking at 4 different forms of financial gravity. I have spent most of my life watching people make the same mistake in different costumes. They think wealth is destroyed by dramatic events. It usually is not. It is destroyed by slow arithmetic that feels normal until it owns your future. Housing is one of the best examples I know. In 2026, the housing market is not simply expensive. It is sorting people. It is separating people who can survive a payment from people who can survive a life. Those are not the same thing. And if you miss that distinction, the house you buy to feel safe can become the machine that keeps you financially ordinary for the next 30 years. That is the first thing I want to burn into your mind. Banks do not underwrite peace. Banks underwrite payment. They do not care whether you can still save. They do not care whether you can still invest. They do not care whether you can still breathe after taxes, insurance, repairs, utilities, and every ugly little surprise that homeownership loves to send through the front door. They care about one thing: will the check clear? If the answer is yes often enough, they call it affordable. I call that dangerous language because a lot of people are not buying a house. They are buying an approved strain level. And the market is getting away with it because most people still use the wrong ruler. They use gross income. Gross income is one of the most flattering lies in personal finance. It is a number you do not live on. It is a number you brag with. It is a number the bank uses to make the deal look cleaner than your actual life will feel. But your mortgage does not get paid by your gross income. It gets paid by what lands in your account after taxes have already taken their cut and after your real life starts asking for money. That is why I do not respect the old ritual of pretending qualification equals comfort. Qualification tells me the lender may get paid. Comfort tells me whether your future still belongs to you. Those are different universes. And in this market, confusing them is the fastest way I know to become house rich on paper and cash poor. So let me tell you what I believe is really happening. The price of a house is no longer the headline. The real headline is the conversion rate between your life and that payment. That is the whole game now. Sticker price is theater. Monthly burden is law. Once you see that, the entire market changes shape. You stop asking, can I get approved? You start asking, what will this payment murder? Will it murder my investing? Will it murder my cash reserves? Will it murder my margin? Will it murder my ability to survive layoffs, illness, bad timing, a broken roof, a dead water heater, a property tax jump, an insurance repricing, or the oldest villain in the book? Plain fatigue, because that is how the middle class actually gets erased. Not in one explosion, in 1,000 monthly deductions. I want to give you a framework that is harder than the one the bank gives you, because hard math is kinder than soft delusion. The Bank S-Classic framework says your housing payment should be around 28% of your gross monthly income, and all your debts together should sit around 36% of gross. That framework is useful for one thing. It tells you how the machine thinks. It does not tell you how you should live. The machine is trying to answer a narrow question. Can you carry enough of the burden long enough for us to earn our spread? I am trying to answer a different question. Can you buy this house without handing away your next decade? That is why I prefer a tougher standard. I want housing costs under roughly 30% of net income. Net income, not the fantasy number. The number that actually shows up. That single change removes a lot of nonsense from the conversation. It forces you to admit that taxes are real. It forces you to admit that retirement contributions change your reality. It forces you to admit that 2 families earning the same salary can be living in 2 different financial planets. One household can make $150,000 and feel flush on paper. Another can make that same amount and have a completely different take-home because of taxes, health care, retirement deferrals, and every other deduction that glossy calculators love to smooth over. That is why broad rules make people feel educated while still leaving them exposed. The market loves averages. Families live in specifics. Now let me show you what I think the market is hiding inside the numbers. I call the first mechanism the price tag illusion. This is the trick that makes buyers focus on the listed number while ignoring the monthly reality. A $250,000 house sounds manageable to a lot of people, and in one sense, it is the most humane tier left in the market. But even here, the trap is already active. If you put 20% down, that is $50,000 in cash before the game even starts. not a promise, not a wish, cash. That alone eliminates a lot of people long before they ever debate mortgage math. Then you finance $200,000 at roughly 6% over 30 years. Your principal and interest lands near $1,200 a month. Add taxes and insurance and your real housing bill can live around $1,500 to $1,700 a month. Use $1,600. And the picture sharpens. By the Bank-S logic, that can be supported by roughly $68,500 a year in gross income. That sounds almost optimistic, but gross optimism is how people get trapped. If you use a net income discipline instead, the same house starts asking for something closer to $85,000 a year in gross pay to feel reasonably livable. That is not a tiny difference. That is the difference between surviving the payment and owning your life. That is the first fracture. The bank says yes sooner than prudence does. Once you understand that, you begin to see why so many buyers feel approved and anxious at the same time. They are not irrational. They are reacting to two different standards. One standard is commercial. The other is human. Now, I call the second mechanism the down payment gate. People talk about mortgages as if the house begins at the monthly payment. It does not. For many families, the real wall is the opening toll. A $500,000 house needs $100,000 down if you want the clean 20% structure. The median savings in America does not even live in the same neighborhood as that requirement. So right away, the market is telling a story it does not say out loud. At this tier, affordability is not just about income. It is also about accumulated history, family help, inheritance, liquidity from a prior sale, a dual income household with years of coordinated discipline, or some mixture of all four. People pretend this is a neutral market. It is not neutral. It rewards existing capital before it rewards current effort. That matters because two people can earn decent money, work hard, do the right things, and still remain locked out simply because they never had the opening pile of cash. That is not a moral statement. It is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not care whether you think the game should be fair. Now look at what a $500,000 house does once the payment starts. With 20% down, you finance $400,000 at 6% for 30 years. Principal and interest comes in around $2,400 a month. Add taxes and insurance, and you are living around $2,800 to $3,000 a month all in. Use $3,000 because reality rarely comes in on the low end when you are trying to protect yourself. That means the Bank-S rule points you toward roughly $128,500 in gross annual income. My standard says you want something closer to $160,000 a year to keep housing near 30% of take-home pay. That is when the problem becomes politically uncomfortable and personally obvious. A $20,000 house is not a luxury fantasy of America now. It is just a normal aspiration, and yet normal aspiration now demands elite cash behavior. Two incomes of $80,000 each can get you there on paper. But life is not lived on paper. If that same household has car payments, child care, student loans, family obligations, or inconsistent bonuses, the gap between doable and punishing gets very thin very fast. That is what the market keeps doing. Now, it keeps taking houses that look normal and attaching income requirements that are not normal at all. That is how a society drifts into a housing crisis without every neighborhood needing to look like a bubble chart on television. Now I call the third mechanism the gross income mirage. This one is subtle, and it does a lot of damage because it sounds respectable. You hear a salary and your brain translates it into power. 150,000, 200,000, 300,000. Those are strong numbers. But housing does not care about the identity value of your salary. Housing cares about the residue. What remains after taxes, what remains after payroll deductions, what remains after the lifestyle you already built starts demanding its own tribute. This becomes brutal at the $1 million tier, because that is where the American conversation gets especially dishonest. A $1 million home sounds like a rich person's house. In many parts of the country, it is on a coast, in a city, in a supply, constrained market. It can be painfully ordinary. That is the new insult. In one region, $1 million buys status. In another, it buys adequacy, and the payment does not care which story you tell yourself about it. With 20% down, you need $200,000 in cash just to enter. Then you finance $800,000 at roughly 6% over 30 years. Principal and interest comes in near $4,800 a month. Add taxes and insurance and $6,000 a month becomes a reasonable working figure. That is where the mirage gets vicious. The Bank-S rule suggests around $257,000 in gross household income. My rule points to something closer to $320,000 a year. and higher if your tax situation is heavier. Read that again slowly. $1 million house can easily require a household earning $320,000 to feel reasonably comfortable. That is before ego, that is before lifestyle inflation, that is before the buyer starts acting like the house is proof of arrival. This is why so many professionals look successful and still feel hunted. They did not buy a home. They accepted a fixed claim on their next decade. And in some of the most expensive cities in America, they did it for a property that would not even look elite to the rest of the country. That is why I keep saying the housing market is sorting people. It is not just moving prices, it is recoding identity. A home that once meant upper comfort now often means upper strain. That is not progress. That is repricing dressed up as aspiration. Now I call the fourth mechanism the jumbo threshold trap at the $1 million level and beyond. Another force begins to work against you. The structure of the loan changes, you start drifting into jumbo territory. And once that happens, the bar rises. Stronger credit, larger reserves, tighter scrutiny, sometimes a slightly higher rate. So the market does not merely ask for more income. It asks for cleaner income, stronger balance sheets, bigger cash buffers, and better optics. This is how the system compounds pressure. The higher you climb, the more it stops being about simple budgeting and starts becoming a test of class position. Not just what you earn, what you hold, not just what you hold, what you can prove. Not just what you can prove, how smoothly you fit the lender's preferred profile. People think expensive housing is just a bigger version of normal housing. It is not. At some point, the transaction itself becomes a filter. The market is no longer asking whether you want the house. It is asking whether you belong in the category of people permitted to own it. And then we get to the $2 million house. This is where social media lies for sport. The internet makes this tier look crowded. It is not. This is a thin slice of the country pretending to be a trend. The cash entry alone can reach $400,000 with a 20% down payment. Then you finance around $1.6 million. Principal and interest alone land near $9,600 a month. Add taxes, insurance, maintenance, and any HOA burden, and $12,000 to $13,000 a month stops looking dramatic and starts looking routine. To keep that near 30% of take-home pay, a household may need something around $40,000 of net income per month. That can translate into roughly $700,000 a year in gross household income, depending on taxes. $700,000. That is not budgeting territory anymore. That is bracket territory. At this level, affordability is not a cute spreadsheet problem. It is a tax bracket admission ticket. And that is why the illusion matters so much. People see the house. I see the category of life required to hold it without panic. Those are different lenses. Only one protects you. Now, I want to introduce the fifth mechanism. I call it the qualification comfort gap. This may be the most dangerous one because it is where respectable people ruin themselves politely. They do everything in the correct order. They get pre-approved. They run a mortgage calculator. They speak to an agent. They hear that their numbers work, and then they stretch. Not because they are reckless, because the system keeps whispering that stretch is normal. Stretch for the school district. Stretch for the commute. Stretch for the yard. Stretch because rates may drop later. Stretch because promotions are coming. Stretch because everyone else seems to be doing it. Stretch because this is the house that proves you are doing well. And then what happens? The mortgage becomes a permanent hostage note attached to the version of you that had zero room for surprise. That is the qualification comfort gap. The distance between what you can technically carry and what you can carry without slowly poisoning the rest of your finances. I have watched that gap wreck more rational people than almost any stock bubble because it hides inside respectable decisions. Nobody feels foolish signing papers at a nice table with a lender, an agent, and a clean spreadsheet. They feel adult. Then 6 months later, the house starts collecting its real price, a plumbing issue, a tax reassessment, insurance repricing, a roof, an HVAC system, a commute that got more expensive, an income change that arrived in the wrong year, a new child, an aging parent, a job market that stopped being kind. And suddenly the family that looked prosperous is operating like a stressed enterprise with one over-leveraged asset and no real margin. That is not home ownership as security. That is home ownership as controlled vulnerability. This is the part where people expect me to say the solution is to stop buying houses. That is not my argument. My argument is harder. You must stop letting the bank define your pain threshold. That is the real reform at the household level. You must build your own operating system. because a house can be a fine purchase, but only if it does not disable the machine that was supposed to create your wealth in the first place. The goal is not to own a house at any cost. The goal is to own a house without becoming owned by it. If you want the cleanest expression of that principle, here it is: your house should support your financial life. It should not replace it. A lot of people are making the opposite trade. They are taking the full economic complexity of their future and exchanging it for one visible asset that flatters them in the present, that flatters the ego and starves the balance sheet. I have never trusted a transaction that makes you look richer while making you less flexible. Housing can do that very effectively. Now let me give you the protocol I would use if I were looking at this market with fresh eyes and no patience for self-deception. First, I would begin with net income, not gross income. I would look at what actually arrives in the account, not what sounds good at dinner. Second, I would set a hard housing ceiling based on the fully loaded monthly cost. That means principal, interest, taxes, insurance, HOA, and a maintenance reserve, not just the mortgage, not the polished number, the total cost of carrying the thing. Third, I would stress test that number against ugliness. What happens if one income disappears for 6 months? What happens if insurance jumps? What happens if I need a major repair inside the first 2 years? What happens if I keep this home and the value does not bail me out? That last one matters a great deal. Too many people still treat home equity like a moral right. It is not. It is a market condition. It can stall. It can reverse. It can underperform your hopes for a long time. So if the house only works when appreciation rescues the purchase never worked. Fourth, I would separate wanting the house from deserving the debt. Those are different questions. You may deserve a beautiful home. That does not mean the numbers deserve your signature. Fifth, I would treat the down payment not as an obstacle, but as a truth serum. If saving the down payment required every ounce of strength you had, do not assume the ownership phase will be easier. Usually the opposite is true. The down payment is the warm-up. Ownership is the event. Sixth, I would measure the opportunity cost with the same seriousness I would bring to a business acquisition. Every extra $1,000 of monthly housing cost is not just a payment. It is foregone investing. It is lost optionality. It is reduced tolerance for career risk. It is lower capacity to buy good assets when panic creates real bargains somewhere else. That matters enormously over a decade. People love to say their house forced them to save. Fine. Sometimes it does. But a house can also force you to stop investing in everything else. That is not discipline. That is crowding out. Seventh, I would refuse the social comparison game. This may be the hardest rule for most people because housing is one of the most public forms of private insecurity. People buy above their comfort level because they do not want their life to look smaller than someone else. That is a very expensive emotion, and it ages badly. I would rather own the less glamorous house with a stronger balance sheet, a thicker cash reserve, and a better investing record than win a neighborhood contest I never needed to enter. Now let me translate all this into the 4 price tiers, because numbers are honest when you force them to be. At $250,000, the market is not easy, but it is still recognizably human. The payment can fit into a disciplined life if the income is real, the down payment exists, and the buyer is not carrying too much other debt. Comfort may live near $85,000 in gross annual pay depending on taxes and local costs. That is still a real hurdle, but it is a hurdle ordinary households can at least imagine clearing. At $500,000, the market starts revealing its new cruelty. Now, $100,000 down becomes the entry toll. The monthly burden pushes toward levels that may require roughly $160,000 of gross income to feel sustainably manageable. That is where normal housing begins requiring uncommon income. At $1 million, the market turns openly selective. $200,000 down, $6,000 a month, all in as a working figure. A household that wants to stay reasonably comfortable may need something around $320,000 a year, and perhaps more depending on taxes and loan structure. That is not a broad middle-class condition. That is upper bracket math attached to increasingly ordinary properties in expensive regions. At $2 million, the market stops speaking the language of budgeting and starts speaking the language of elite income classification. $400,000 down, $12,000 to $13,000 a month, perhaps $700,000 of gross household income to hold it with real comfort. That is not for most people, no matter how often the internet pretends otherwise. Now, some people hear numbers like these and fall into despair. I do not think despair is useful. I think clarity is useful. The purpose of brutal math is not to depress you. It is to stop you from entering a 30-year arrangement under false emotional packaging. False hope is expensive, clear limits are cheap. This is especially important because there is another lie sitting underneath the whole conversation. People say housing is unaffordable because prices rose. That is only part of the story. The deeper truth is that the interaction between prices, rates, taxes, insurance, and stagnant relative purchasing power has rewritten the entire affordability map. That is why I keep returning to one sentence. Sticker price is theater. Carrying cost is law. If rates were much lower, some of these houses would feel different. If taxes were lighter, they would feel different. If insurance had not become its own predator in certain markets, they would feel different. If wages had run ahead faster, they would feel different. But you do not buy the market you wish existed. You buy the market that is actually in front of you. And the market in front of you right now is merciless to buyers who confuse permission with prudence. So here is the identity flip I want you to make. Stop seeing yourself as a shopper trying to win a house. See yourself as a capital allocator, deciding whether one asset deserves a huge percentage of your future cash flow. That is a much stronger identity. Shoppers get emotional, allocators get precise. Shoppers ask, can I make this work? Allocators ask, what will this cost me beyond the payment? Shoppers want a key. Allocators want control. The housing market is very good at rewarding the first mindset with excitement. Life is very good at rewarding the second with peace. I know which one I trust. And let me tell you something else. A lot of people secretly know the math is ugly, but they still push through because they assume discomfort is temporary and ownership will eventually feel light. Sometimes that is true, often it is not. Sometimes rates fall, sometimes incomes rise. Sometimes the house does appreciate and the buyer looks brilliant. But I do not build my decisions on outcomes that require the future to cooperate. That is speculation wearing a family face. A safe house purchase should work even if the future arrives late, cold, and unhelpful. If it only works in the optimistic case, it never worked. That is the sentence I wish more buyers would tape to the inside of their eyelids. If it only works in the optimistic case, it never worked. Now I want to end where most people should begin. Run your own numbers. Not the lender's numbers. Not the realtor's numbers. Not the online calculator that quietly assumes you will be more comfortable than you really are. Your numbers, your taxes, your retirement contributions, your debts, your child care, your maintenance assumptions, your insurance reality, your tolerance for risk, your actual take-home pay. And then once you have that honest number, do not violate it just because the market tells you everyone else is doing it. Everyone else is not carrying your future. You are. That is why I would rather disappoint my ego than injure my balance sheet. I would rather buy late than buy trapped. I would rather own less house and more life. I would rather have a modest address and real investing power than a flashy address and permanent monthly fear. Because in the end, the house is supposed to be shelter. The moment it becomes your dominant financial fact, it stops being shelter and starts being a system of control. That is the knife edge in 2026. Not whether houses are expensive, whether you are smart enough to know when the payment is trying to own you. If you miss that, you will spend years telling yourself you own a home while the home quietly owns your options. And that is not the American dream. That is a beautiful debt costume. I have no interest in buying costumes. I want control. And if I cannot buy the house without losing that, I do not have a housing problem. I have my answer.